co-edited 2 anthologies, one of which is called Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. Her nonfiction book, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption, won the 2017 Oregon Book Award. And she is also the author of a collection of poetry called Scars/Stars. For 6 years, she presented statewide as a public scholar with Oregon Humanities Conversation Project on topics such as Oregon Black History, alternatives to incarceration, and the history of hip hop. She's taught at Stanford, Pacific Northwest, and Portland State's Black Studies Department. I believe she's the head of the Black Studies Department now. And we are very pleased to have her tonight. Please join me in welcoming Walidah Imarisha.
Thanks so much, Ebony. It's so exciting to see you for our 1-year anniversary. What a difference a year makes. But I'm really excited to be here. Thankful to you and to BCLA and to the library for hosting me and for creating this space to talk about Afrofuturism, Black futurism, how we change the futures, and I'm excited to nerd out with y'all. Just want to be clear, I am not the head of the Black Studies Department. I'm the director of the Center for Black Studies, which is the Black Studies Department's research center. So
thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, I don't want people thinking I'm out here claiming a job I do not have. So. But I'm really excited to engage with everyone who's here, and I'm going to give a short presentation around Afrofuturism, Black futurism, and then we're going to have a lot of time for question and answer. So I know that there's a question and answer tab at the bottom of folks' Zoom windows, so please feel free to write questions in there, and when I'm finished, we'll jump into that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we are going to get into it. So I'm very proud to be a Black futurist. I've been a nerd since birth, and I've obviously been Black since birth as well. So I came by this all honestly and naturally. The term Afrofuturism is, it's big and it means a lot of different things to different folks. I'm not going to be doing a sort of overview of the term Afrofuturism or the history of it. I'm going to be more focusing in on my work around radical social change and visionary fiction, futurism, and showing how it's fundamentally rooted in Afrofuturism or Black futurism. But to just give a little bit of framing, if there are folks who haven't encountered the concept of Afrofuturism before, folks frame it a number of different ways as a sort of cultural aesthetic, as something that is a way of, sort of engaging aesthetically and culturally, as a genre of art, as a philosophy of science and or a philosophy of history. But specifically for me, I frame it, Afrofuturism or Black futurism, I frame it as a way of being, as a way of knowing, as a way of interacting with the world, as a way of dreaming new possibilities, and specifically as a way of building those possibilities into the future. I believe the charge of Black futurists is to change the future, because that is the past of Black futurists. Black folks have been visionaries for centuries, for millennia, and we have changed the world over and over and over again. So that is our birthright. And to me, Black futurism is about claiming that and then doing the work to prepare ourselves individually and even more importantly, collectively, to continue that legacy of visionary change. So the term itself, Afrofuturism, was coined in 1993 by Mark Derry, who was a white man. And so, there's a lot about that term, and some folks have a lot of feelings about that. But what I think is really important to recognize is that what was called Afrofuturism, what is called Afrofuturism, again, is something that Black folks have been doing in and of itself for a millennia. I fundamentally believe that blackness itself has always been futuristic, has always been visionary. From the birth of humanity in Africa to the, creating innovations that at the time were considered to be impossible fantasies, everything from language to writing to math to on and on and on, changing the world over and over again by creating and exploring. And I think that's a fundamental part of Black culture and Black history. And so that carried on in our cultural DNA into, this nation and the enslavement of Black folks. And I think of enslaved Black folks as the most courageous, brilliant sci-fi creators of ever, because they dreamed of a freedom they were told again and again would be a complete impossibility. And they dreamed what they were told was impossible dreams, and then they changed the entire world to make them our lived reality. So again, to me, it's important to recognize, whatever term you call it, this is not something that started in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. This is something that Black folks have done, not just as writers or visual artists or filmmakers or musicians, but as human beings, as folks who dream impossible dreams and then change the entire world to make them lived reality. So, just wanting to root in that idea. So just for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing sort of on the areas of literature and then organizing and showing how Black futurism shows up in those spaces. But, again, Afrofuturism is not just a literature genre, even if we're just talking about cultural production. We have Afrofuturist or Black futurist films, music, visual art, fashion, every possible artistic expression. It's not a genre. Again, it's a way of engaging. So again, I'm not going to be going into all of the definitions, all of the history. So I wanted to offer up that this is a wealth of information that is available around Afrofuturism and Black folks dreaming futures and dreaming pasts as well. And so these are just a few books that are also in the chat as well, that you can get from the library or get online. And some of these are analysis, so sort of looking at how this came to be and how this manifests in different areas. And then the last three are actually anthologies. So Mothership and then Dark Matter, volumes 1 and 2 are anthologies of Afrofuturist or speculative fiction written by Black people. And so if you are looking for a place to start with your reading, those are great places because they have an array of folks, and especially Dark Matter, which came out in the 90s. The subheading, which I don't think you can read on this, is 100 years of speculative fiction from the African diaspora. And so it's a huge, incredible resource. And just one other resource I wanted to share is a really amazing history of Black science fiction that was created by Nisi Shawl. And so it is a list of Black science fiction, again, starting from well over 100 years ago. And I think that just got dropped in the chat. So if you're wanting to read kind of more novels or book length stories, Nisi lists dozens of those that go from the 1800s of Black folks writing speculative fiction on up until the 2010s. So that's another resource that's available for folks as well. But I wanted to focus in on Dark Matter right now, because again, this anthology, there's a volume 1 and then volume 2 is Reading the Bones. But I was lucky enough to encounter Dark Matter when I was still a teen, and it changed my life because again, it offered not only so many voices of Black people writing science fiction, speculative fiction, but it spanned 100 years. And at that point, I had no idea that Black folks had been writing and creating visionary fiction, science fiction for that long. And the one story that I want to start with, which starts is near the beginning of the anthology, is W.B. Du Bois's The Comet. So many folks know W.B. Du Bois as a brilliant Pan-Africanist thinker and theorist and organizer. He helped to start the original NAACP and was involved in organizing work for decades on so many different levels. He is incredibly brilliant, and his brilliant analysis of race in America is still, unfortunately, incredibly relevant for today. But many people don't know that he actually wrote science fiction and fantasy as well. And I think that that's really important, because I think that the genres of science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, these fantastical genres are often maligned, and they're often sort of framed as escapist, as something you do for fun. It's not real literature, right? It gets lumped in with romance or mystery or Westerns as genre literature, which is, is different than literature with a capital L. But, to me, the fact that W.B. Du Bois wrote science fiction and fantasy and included them in his books of analysis on race, like Darkwater, which is where The Comet was printed. And, it's beside essays about the state of race relations in America. And then you have these science fiction or fantasy stories just there as well that Du Bois wrote. And so The Comet is a really powerful story. I won't ruin it. No spoilers of the ending, but it begins following a Black man who works at a bank doing menial labor, and he ends up in the vault, and so survives a comet passing over New York City. The toxins kill seemingly everyone else, and so he's wandering through New York, thinking he might be the last man alive in New York, maybe the last man alive in the world, and then he finds a wealthy white woman. And so he's a working class Black man, she's a wealthy white woman. As far as they can tell, they're the only people left in New York and maybe the planet. I will leave it there. But W.B. Du Bois, again, wrote this in 1920. And so it was, brilliant commentary on race relations. And in fact, that story resulted in the Ku Klux Klan calling for his murder as well, which of course they already wanted. But just to see the power of this genre and to recognize that it is something that has been, acknowledged as not only a useful tool for Black thinkers, but something that they do naturally and engage in and sort of insert into their work as part of it. So, I wanted to start there. And so again, that's at the beginning of the Dark Matter collection that was edited by Cherie Renee Thomas and came out in the 90s. And then sharing, this is, I believe, the last story in the Dark Matter collection, is Derek Bell's story, The Space Traders, which I believe he wrote in the late 80s or early 90s. And we're gonna, it was made into a short film through HBO in the 90s on a anthology series called Cosmic Slop. And so I'm just gonna show you the very beginning of it. I think the full piece of Space Traders is about 20 minutes. And then Cosmic Slop itself, I think, is about an hour long. But just it stays pretty true to the path of Derek Bell's story. So I'm just going to share this clip, which again is based on his story.
Feel the excitement in the crowd.
Bernie, some of these people have been out here since 2 o'clock this morning, though the aliens aren't scheduled to arrive before noon. But as you can see, the crowd is getting pretty excited as America prepares for its first encounter with space since NASA went bankrupt back in 1998. It's quite a circus.
Thank you, Stryker. Of course, we will go back to Plymouth Rock the moment the aliens are sighted. In other news, The Environmental Protection Agency has added Hartford, Connecticut to its list of cities to be evacuated by year's end. Carcinogen levels there have topped those found in Baltimore last year. The gap between black salaries and white widened. Wait, something's now happening at Plymouth Rock. Stryker.
Well, as you can hear, Bernie, there's definitely something going on now. We can't see anything yet, but this humming is definitely growing louder. You know, ever since the alien signal was first received some 3 months ago, speculation has run rampant as to their appearance, the size and shape of their craft. Oh my God! Literally, a flotilla of spacecraft have just materialized from nowhere right over our heads. This is absolutely amazing. This is literally an unbelievable sight. You know, as I look to my left, I see Vice President D'Amato and Secretary of State Buchanan approaching the microphone. For those of you who are concerned, President Taylor, of course, is safe and secure in an undisclosed bunker until it's determined whether or not these aliens pose any threat.
Hello? Hello? Is this on? Can you understand me? I'm the Vice President.
We are space traders bearing exquisite gifts that will restore your nation to its former glory. Nearly limitless quantities of gold and precious metals that will instantly erase your deficit. Machines that will renew your rivers and your air. Cold fusion technology for a safe, cheap, and inexhaustible source of energy. All we ask in return is the delivery to our vessels 5 days from now. Every child, woman, and man in your nation with at least 2,500 milligrams of melanin in their skin per square centimeter.
What the hell is melanin?
Put more simply, in trade for solving all your most pressing domestic catastrophes, we are asking for every person in your country that you would classify as black.
Are you kidding?
No, we are not.
What are you going to do with them?
Well, that does not concern you. We give you 5 days to decide, and the offer is non-negotiable. We will not try to coerce you in any way. Yet, I hope we can do some business together.
So that's how Space Trader starts, and it goes from there. And there's so many things that are so brilliant about this. I mean, you know, from Ronald Reagan being the face that the aliens choose for themselves. But in this short story, as well as in this version, the aliens in the short story, which is, you know, it's a longer short story. It's probably, I think, around 40 pages or more. The aliens are really only in it for the first 3 or 4 pages. And then the rest of the story is how would America at the time in the late 80s or early 90s, how would it deal with this offer by these space traders to solve all of America's problems by taking away but in exchange for taking away all the Black people. And it goes through every different sort of social group and seeing the political machinations. So at the end of the day, really what Derek Bell created is a science fiction story where the aliens really only exist for the first 3 pages, and the rest is basically the real world political machinations of race relations in America. And, you know, I've been inspired by this story since I read it in my teens. And I actually ended up writing a sort of companion speak back piece to it called Space Traitors, like Benedict Arnold Traitors, where aliens come and offer Black folks to take us away to be part of an intergalactic revolutionary uprising. So anyway, I won't spoil either of them for you. But, you know, I think it's really powerful the way that this sort of speaks back to mainstream science fiction and this sort of mainstream notion of alien invasion that so often happens, and how all of humanity is shown as united together against this alien invasion, but often when Black folks are actually the ones writing it, we see there's so much more, nuanced in realities. We can't just erase away the structural, systemic white supremacy that this nation is founded on, as if somehow aliens would erase all of that. So another sort of, frame of mainstream science fiction is it's most often only interested in the future. And so, oh, my apologies. It's often, focused on this notion of, what comes next and our sort of linear progression towards greatness, which is a white supremacist colonial justification, right? The idea that we, there are primitives and savages, which means brown people. The intervention of Western colonialism is continually moving humanity towards civilization. And so the reality is that all cultures of color challenge the notion of sort of linear time and a linear progression, and instead recognize that time is cyclical and change is cyclical, and the necessity to understand that especially rooting in Black futurism, we can't think of it as a one-way street. Black futurism often takes place in the past as well as the future. There's often, time is permeable, it is malleable. It recognizes our cultural roots of Black folks and really all folks of color, that says, time is not a straight line. And I really sort of root in this West African and Dinkra symbology, specifically the symbol Sankofa, which means go back and get what is lost. And Sankofa can be drawn two separate ways, either as this elaborate heart, or as this bird that is moving forward, but it's facing backward with an egg in its mouth. So really that notion that nothing is lost to us in the past, it is always present and available. And for Black folks who are wanting to change the future, who are, serious about the important work and the important legacy that has been tasked to us, we have to recognize that we are dreaming in concert with our ancestors. We are not separate with them. So we have to engage in a sort of non-linear, decolonized dreaming that is rooted in Blackness. And when we do that, we see that the future and the past really come together. And we have to recognize that to build liberated futures, we must root in liberated pasts. And so I'm just going to give a few examples of folks who are doing that in the real world, because I absolutely, I love the artistic expressions of Afrofuturism and Black futurism. And I also think, how can we be using those to inspire what's happening in the real world? And there are many people who are bridging that gap between the artistic explorations of Black futurism and the realities of Black existence. And so they are really breathing life into Black futurism. So one example I wanted to share is Black quantum futurism. And this is really a multidisciplinary collaboration. It's rooted in Philadelphia between two incredible artists, but they bring in other folks as well. And they've engaged in this kind of notion of, Black quantum existence on so many different levels. And so they started a time exchange, which was a physical location in Philadelphia, a Black time exchange. They've engaged in art exhibits, in doing workshops that challenge linear time. And Rashida Phillips, who is one of the two folks who founded this, actually edited this anthology, and there's a volume 2 as well, Black Quantum Futurism. And so in it, it's really exploring that notion. There's a lot in there, but really, rooting in that notion that Blackness inherent in itself is a quantum existence, where we exist outside of linear time, where we prove the lie of linear time. We exist in multiple points. It really explores, there's a chart in it that's beautiful that explores like all of quantum physics, and then specific expressions of Black understandings of time. There's one essay that explores concretely different African society's notion of time and compares that to quantum physics. So I'd encourage folks to check out their work, both in writing and then in practice and in motion. Another example that I have been incredibly inspired by, that I consider to be challenging the notion of linear time, is the slave rebellion reenactment. And this was held in November of 2019 in Louisiana. And it was imagined and created by the artist Dred Scott. And it followed one of the largest slave uprisings in the country, which occurred in Louisiana. At the end of the day, 500 enslaved Black folks rose up and they went on a 3-day march throughout Louisiana, going to Baton Rouge to take the capital. And their goal was to create a liberated Black nation in Louisiana. So they weren't just arguing for better treatment from those who had enslaved them. They weren't even arguing to end slavery in all of the United States. They specifically were saying, we are rising up to create a separate Black socialist nation within the United States. And so in leading up to 2019, Dred Scott spent years pulling together this sort of multimedia, this multimedia historical embodiment, where at the end of the day, 500 Black folks in clothes that were made to look like period clothes, using much of the same technologies, carrying weapons, went on the same march that their ancestors did, literally stepping into and embodying that historic Black resistance, and just bringing forth what I consider to be subversive Black liberation time travel. And so this is an example that continually inspires me. And I have one more example that comes from my own work. So I've worked at a youth prison here in Oregon, and we actually watched the film See You Yesterday, which is about Black time travel, specifically in the context of trying to stop a police shooting. And so I watched this with the youth at the Black cultural group at the youth prison. And then we talked about, if they could go back in time and engage in historical interventions, what would they be? And it was incredible to see what they came up with. And I'm not gonna read all of the pieces that they came up with, but really asking them, what time in history would you travel to and what changes would you make? It was incredible to hear their answers. And I think even more, it was incredible for them to sort of realize that there were these historical possibilities and moments where history could have gone very differently. And sometimes it really turned on the flip of a coin. And for them to bring that same energy to the possibilities of creating futures, and to know literally anything is possible. And for them to be able to sort of root in that expansive vision, and to be in communion with creating the futures in unison with their ancestors. So, this is just some of the sort of interventions they came up with. And, again, providing Nat Turner support so that his rebellion against slavery was successful, everything to aliens coming during civil rights and teaming up with Black folks to fight racism, which is a streaming show I need to watch right now. I need to binge that. I think my favorite is destroying all the boats in Europe pre-colonization and putting Europe in a global timeout until the entire European continent decides to act right. And then it's allowed back into the global community. So again, just ways that this work can be brought into and out of sort of the artistic realm into the world, and specifically using a piece of Afrofuturist art, the film See You Yesterday, to inspire real world conversations. So that notion of bringing this, this into the real world is what so much of my work is about. And so I started using the term visionary fiction to describe my work. And I have come up with a definition for visionary fiction. It is fantastical art that helps us understand and challenge existing power structures and supports us in imagining paths to dreaming and creating more just worlds. So visionary fiction is deeply rooted in the idea of changing the world and of changing our not only our futures, but our present as well. It is intimately and intricately tied with radical organizing, with liberation movements. It is not a thought experiment. The idea is, how do we dream new worlds and then build them into existence now? And so I came up with some principles for visionary fiction. So thinking about, if you're seeing something, if you're engaging with something, how do you know if it's visionary fiction? And doing that work, not just by myself, in community, which is how visionary fiction should be done. Visionary fiction does not exist in isolation. It exists in a collective existence. And so there are so many incredible people doing similar work who helped me to shape these ideas. But really realizing the two main areas that you can identify visionary fiction through is identity and power. And so we're talking about literature. For identity, it's whose story is being told and through whose eyes. So it centers the leadership of the marginalized and most affected. We're looking through the eyes of the oppressed and recognizing that it doesn't just add to the story, it changes the entire, it changes the entire story. And really recognizing that that centering the most marginalized and oppressed means centering folks who live at the intersections of identity and oppression. So recognizing that when we center queer and trans folks of color, when we center undocumented folks with disability, when we center folks who are at the intersections of all of those identities and more, that's what we see what true liberation for our entire community can look like. So it is absolutely and vitally imperative that we recognize everyone has a multiplicity of identities, and that we are centering those folks who are sitting at the intersections of intersecting identities and of oppression. And I already, talked about this previously, but again, rooting in Blackness as decolonized nonlinear dreaming, recognizing that if it is truly visionary fiction, it is rooting in and paying respect to and engaging in an understanding of the responsibility of, focusing on those histories from Black folks and from other cultures of color. And then the other piece is power. So visionary fiction is very clear that power inequalities exist. They are institutionalized, they are systemic. It makes visible systems of power. And I think the hardest part as someone who, writes visionary fiction and creates visionary fiction is it imagines different relationships to power. And this is where I think it's a responsibility, and it can be, it can feel daunting. And that's why it's so necessary and important to do it in community, to say, if we want a different society, then we need to engage in creating different kinds of systems. We can't create the same hierarchical oppressive systems and think we're going to get something different. So specifically, that looks like, concretely, the change will look like it being collective from the bottom up, not the top down. Leadership is decentralized. It is generative. It creates opportunities and possibilities for more and more people to enter into it. It is holistic and to the bone. It is not surface reform. Reform is actually the boundaries of what society will allow you to do. And so reform is often a method of social control. If that reform is not leading to larger change and institutional systemic change, because reform then becomes, this is how much adaptation this system is willing to allow, that allows it to maintain its power and continuing functioning, mostly as business as usual. The change in visionary fiction is non-transactional and anti-capitalist, and it is relational. It recognizes that the relationship between people is important, and if those relationships are exploitative, if they are weak, then that is what we are going to replicate. And lastly, visionary fiction is not neutral, and we don't purport to be. My co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Adrienne Marie Brown, says all art either advances or regresses justice. And we're very proud that we are on the side of trying to advance justice. So, again, visionary fiction is inextricably linked to community organizing, to liberation movements. And it rests on the premise that all organizing is science fiction. So every time we imagine a world without borders, a world without police, a world without oppression, that is science fiction, because we've never seen it. But we can't build what we can't imagine. So we absolutely need imaginative spaces like science fiction that allow us to throw out everything we've been told is possible and to root in what we want, rather than what is the reform that this system has told us is possible. That is the only way that we're going to see what true liberation looks like. And we have to practice this, because this entire society has spent the entirety of our lives telling us that these things are possible and everything else is not possible. And we cannot imagine a world without prisons, because a society can't exist without prisons. Even though this society did exist without prisons, other societies have and do exist without prisons. Communities within the society exist without prisons. But we have to have spaces to practice imagining beyond these barriers that have been constructed for us. And I believe a space like visionary fiction allows that continual practicing of saying, but what if we dream bigger? What if we dream bigger from that? What if we dream bigger from that? Because the reality is that really, once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is truly limitless. And that's the foundation of the anthology that I co-edited with Adrienne Marie Brown that I mentioned, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. And in it, we have 20 short stories and 2 essays of fantastical writing written by organizers, activists, and change makers. And many of them had never written fiction, let alone science fiction. But as we said, all organizing is science fiction. So we absolutely knew these people who were holding and creating the just worlds that we all dreamed about were the perfect people to bring to life these visionary fiction stories that could help us, lead us towards a more just world. And I'm incredibly proud to have been part of this project, and to be able to be in community and communion with these folks. And Octavia's Brood is named for Octavia E. Butler, who was an incredible science fiction writer, public intellectual, Black feminist giant. Unfortunately, she passed away, but her work is foundational to not only Octavia's Brood, but my own work. I realized once I had been working in community with other folks to create the principles for visionary fiction, that the place that I saw them first in practice in science fiction was the work of Octavia E. Butler. And so she has always been very conscious as an Afrofuturist, as a Black futurist, as a Black visionary, about those pieces of both identity and power, and the responsibility of the creator to address both. And so I just want to play a short video that comes from 2 interviews that she did. One of them was an interview she did on Charlie Rose, where she talks sort of about identity and her own experiences dealing with the white supremacy in the larger science fiction community. And the second is from a documentary called Black Sci-Fi that was on the BBC. And she talks about this notion of power and her writing. So I'm gonna just share that, and they're just clips from those 2 interviews.
What then is central to what you want to say about race?
So aside from, hey, we're here.
Yeah, right, that's right. And we're gonna be here.
Yeah.
We are here.
Mm-hmm. When I was just getting started, around 79, I guess it was, my books were just starting to do reasonably well. I was on a convention, right, a science fiction convention panel. The guy next to me was an editor, and he said he thought that it wasn't really necessary to have black characters in science fiction, because you could always say make any racial statement you needed to make by way of extraterrestrials. And if he was trying to start trouble, he certainly succeeded. It's a wonderful way to think about possibilities. It's a wonderful way to explore exotic politics. It's a wonderful way, it's a freedom. It's a way of doing anything you want. There are all sorts of walls around other genres. Romances, mysteries, westerns. There are no real walls around science fiction. We can build them, but they're not there naturally. My paternists are people, a gathering of mutants, really. They're not extraterrestrial or anything, and they're not gathered for any particularly good purpose. They're gathered because a rather odious character is lonely and very long-lived, so he breeds them. He also eats them, in a sense. I think, really, a lot of my early writing had to do with my own feelings of powerlessness. So I dealt often with power, with what it did to people, what they did with it when they got it. And what I do in the Xenogenesis books is explain what that is. I have aliens who arrive and who are interested in us because they are natural genetic engineers. They are gene traders, as a matter of fact, but who tell us that we have this conflict within ourselves. All too often, our intelligence serves our hierarchical tendencies, so that we tend to one-up ourselves to death.
So I always love to bring Octavia's voice into the room. And, you know, again, especially, I think her work is so important and relevant, and she's been getting so much attention lately, absolutely earned, because of her exploration of power and the imagining of different relationships to it, and the lessons that we can learn from that to implement in the real world. And so, you know, I want to move us into that piece around the real world. And to just really, again, reiterate that, to me, Afrofuturism, Black futurism isn't just a literary genre or an artistic genre. It's again, a way of being, a way of knowing, a way of dreaming, and a way of building new futures. And, you know, I think a lot when I see organizing work that is visionary, I consider that to be visionary fiction as well. But it is, you know, visionary fiction in practice, in motion, and absolutely thinking about the, you know, courageous, inspiring, visionary organizing of that was Black-led and Black youth-led across the world, across this country, and here in Portland, over the last year around the latest movement and moment around Black Lives Matter, and just how visionary the framing and the demands were as well. That embedded in this was a challenge to the institution of policing itself, saying, we have tried reform, we have tried every reform, especially in cities like Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, as well as places like Portland. And it has not changed the ways that these systems function. And so therefore, there's something fundamentally wrong with these systems, or not wrong, that these systems are actually functioning as they were intended to, as they were started to. The system of policing was created as a racialized mechanism to control, contain, and exploit Black communities and other potentially rebellious communities. And so they are functioning as they were intended. And if that is the case, then how do we imagine beyond what we're told is possible? How do we dream impossible dreams about what safety looks like, about what justice looks like, that are rooted in a Black framework and a Black understanding and in Black freedom and dignity? And then how do we build that into existence? And so, that tying together of the calls to defund the police or even abolish the police and replace them with community-based systems that are about wholeness, that are about restoration, that are about transformation and healing, rather than retribution and punishment, is incredibly inspiring and powerful. And I'm so thankful to, again, the Black folks and especially the Black youth who courageously did and are still putting their bodies on the line, as well as, the folks who have been holding that abolitionist space for decades. And I just want to be clear that like Black futurism, this is not something that is new. I mean, we can, if you trace back prisons and policing to the institutions of slavery, which you absolutely can and should, then, through books like Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete and Ruthie Gilmore's Golden Gulag and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, then, we recognize that as part of the long history calling for the complete reimagining and replacement. But even
what then is central?
Again, apologies. Even in the 60s and 70s, this was something that was discussed and talked about. And specifically, I want to raise up the Black Panther Party, which I think was an incredibly visionary organization. And Alondra Nelson actually talked about the Black Panther Party as science fiction creators, because they looked around their communities and they said, what are we not seeing? What have we never seen? And then how do we build that into existence? And they started their survival pending revolution programs, things like the Free Breakfast for Children program, because they had never seen the children in their community fed properly, consistently every day. They started free healthcare clinics because they had never seen their community able to access quality free healthcare. They started liberation schools rooted in Black culture and understanding, and on and on. And so one of the things that they did in their 10-point platform was to call for the abolition of prisons and the carceral system. And so their point number 9 said, "We want freedom for all Black and poor oppressed people now held in US, federal, state, county, city, and military prisons and jails. We want trials by a jury of peers for all persons charged with so-called crimes under the laws of this country." And then they went on to say, "We believe in the ultimate elimination of all wretched, inhuman penal institutions, because the masses of men and women imprisoned inside the United States or by the US military are the victims of oppressive conditions, which are the real cause of their imprisonment." So again, looking at this larger picture and imagining and dreaming what they're being told is science fiction. And they said, well, let's practice dreaming beyond that together then and see how to build that into existence. And I was lucky enough to be part of a project last summer that I feel like builds on that framework of imagining and then putting out into the world. And so the group Wakanda Dream Lab partnered with Policy Link to bring together a group of Black creators to imagine a post-abolition world. So in the call to defund the police or abolish the police, to challenge the carceral system, the question then became, well, what would this look like? And so the process was beautiful. It's actually one that I facilitate, of coming together and dreaming a world collectively around a social issue, and then creating individually within that world. So we together dreamed a post-abolition world that had these shared touch points, one of them being Abolition Day. And the anthology is called Memories of Abolition Day. So Abolition Day in our world is the day that the last prison closes. And so we imagine this world together, and then we wrote individual stories within them. And it was incredibly powerful because those stories that we wrote individually ended up spanning 500 years, starting, in the early 1900s and then going all the way, 500 years later to 2400. And I think it was incredible that we sort of naturally went to this, and it shows abolition as both a process and a practice, that this is not something, it's not a destination we'll reach. It is something that we enact, that we embody, and that we continue to refine and imagine and push ourselves to continually do and be better. And so you can actually download Memories of Abolition Day for free online as a PDF. And there are so many great stories as well as beautiful artwork that you can engage with. And just the last piece I want to do is to raise up one of those stories by Dr. Lisa Bates, who actually teaches at Portland State University in the urban planning department and urban studies department. And we have worked on projects together, and I'm continually impressed by Lisa's brilliance. And she created a story set in Portland in the future, post-Abolition Day, called Albina Zone, which I set mine in Philadelphia, which was where I used to live, because I was challenged to imagine a post-abolitionist Portland and what that would look like, especially rooted in Afrofuturism or Black futurism. And I was like, I don't know how we're going to do that here. And so I didn't do it. And again, this is why we are better and smarter together and collectively, because reading Lisa's piece, just opened up my mind in a million different ways. But her piece takes place after Abolition Day, after the last prison has closed. There has been white flight from North and Northeast Portland, because the Black folks who are incarcerated are now returning to North and Northeast Portland, which is where the majority of folks are from. And so North and Northeast Portland actually become an autonomous zone called Albina Zone. And it is sort of given back to Black folks as a form of reparations to the Black community, but it's administered by nonprofits, by mostly white organizations. And so, this beautiful piece really explores the complexities and the tensions, and again shows, abolition is not a destination. So even after the closing of the last prison, the question becomes, how do we continue to create more and more freedom? How do we look at the ways that, the carceral system has, embedded itself into our entire society? So, the whole collection does that through asking, a series of questions, things like how might we embody community restorative justice? Or what is your most irresistible freedom dream? And I'm just going to end the presentation there, because I feel like that's a great question to end on. What is your most irresistible freedom dream? And so I appreciate y'all listening and being here as part of the event. And I'm excited to engage with questions from folks and folks' thoughts and responses. So thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Walidah, for that very, very brilliant presentation. I am so happy that I got a chance to see it. And I also, I have questions of my own, but I know that our audience also may have some questions. So I will take a look at the chat. Let's see. Well, if they don't have questions, I definitely do. Are there any projects that you are currently working on that you have in the works? I mean, I hate this question, and I know that authors also hate it, but I'm so curious to know what you're working on right now.
Yeah, I'm definitely working on short stories. I have a lot of writing projects that I'm, in theory working on. I think this has been a challenging past year, and I have found it very challenging as a writer to find this sort of space and mental center to be able to create. And I've definitely seen other folks posting online, and they have used this time to be very prolific, and that's amazing. I like to be very honest about my own process and frustrations this past year, because I think that that's real, and I think that that's reasonable as well. And so, I know that there was a lot of folks, especially during the early time of the pandemic, when they're like, think of this stay-at-home time as a writer's retreat. And I'm like, what? Or think of it as a continual 9 hours a day of refreshing news sources, trying to figure out what's happening because you're terrified for everyone you love in the entire world. So, it's been a challenging year for a lot of us. But one project I am working on that I'm very excited about is actually a film project. And so working on kind of bringing these ideas and these visions of Black liberated futures into the film arena. And I'm working with my friend who is an incredible filmmaker. I have made a short documentary, but I'm not a filmmaker, which when he approached me, I was like, I'm not a filmmaker. And he's like, yes, but we don't all have to be filmmakers. So I'm really excited. And that project has actually been one that I felt like I can continually work on this past year. I think because it's sort of a different genre, it's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of engaging. And it's also something I'm doing in collaboration with other folks. We brought more people into the project as well. So it is a collaborative process. So, I would just encourage, if there are artistic folks who are feeling challenged right now, to think about, are there other ways to approach this, and or are there other people that you can be collaborating with? Because especially in the context of imagining new just futures, that's not something we can do alone. And we are all so much more brilliant and incredible together. And I've seen that facilitating the collective writing and visioning workshops that I talked about, that led to the process of Memories of Abolition Day for years. But actually being in Memories of Abolition Day was my first time being a participant in that process, and being able to say, like, hey, I have this sort of half-formed idea, but I don't really know how that works. And have someone else say, oh, what if this? And I'm like, that is the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. Oh my God. And it felt so, it was all of the excitement and none of the pressure that you have as an individual creator, where you're like, I have to figure out everything. And if I come up with an idea and it's not working, I have to figure it out. But being in a group meant you could just be like, hey, what about this? I don't know how to make it work. And someone else is like, boom, here's how it works. You're like, that's amazing. So, now I think now is the time for collective action, and to recognize it's not a choice between individual brilliance and collectivity. There's always space in the collective for our individual brilliance and engagement.
There are a couple of questions in the chat and in the question and answer boxes. April Kaiser asked, what techniques or resources would you recommend to folks who want to facilitate a social justice dreaming process?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage folks to read the work of my Octavia's Brood co-editor, Adrienne Maree Brown. She has an incredible book called Emergent Strategy. And so she was sort of doing emergent strategy and I was doing visionary fiction. And then we came together to do Octavia's Brood. And so we sort of think of them as like little ideas that grew up together and influenced one another, and I like to think of them as like best friends hanging out. So I think visionary fiction is sort of the space of imagination that allows us to go beyond what we're being told is possible, and then emergent strategy is how we build visionary fiction into existence. And so I'd encourage folks to read Adrienne's book, especially Emergent Strategy. She also has a blog where she writes incredibly brilliant things. She's editing a series with AK Press right now of sort of visionary organizing and thinking. So she has a lot of resources, and I'd encourage folks to engage with that. But you can start small as well, and just my hope is that all of our organizations, all of our community movements, all of our collective spaces, we begin just even asking and imagining. If you're working on an issue, say, start a meeting and say, what will this issue look like in 100 years if we've been winning? I think we often imagine out the worst case scenarios, and that's important. And we need to do that. And we need to know that even if those things happen, we can still organize and we can still win, right? So it's important to, have space to say, if this goes horribly wrong, how are we going to still organize and build these futures we want? Because we're going to always do that. But also, why don't we take some time to imagine, what if we've been winning for 100 years? What if we've had successful campaigns? What if we've been doing the work and we've been moving forward? What does that world look like? Because then we create a shared vision and goal that is long-term, and it allows us to then begin working backwards. It makes it more tangible. And so we're like, oh, okay, well, what is the first step in that direction then? Rather than just saying, we know what we don't want and we're pushing against that. How do we then say, what are we moving towards then? What are we holding and desiring?
The questions that are in the chat are related. So related to the question of what kind of authors are out there, do you have any authors of African, and the person specifies African continent futurism or visionary fiction that you enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's so much work that's happening, and there's really been an explosion of, visionary and Afrofuturist, Black futurist, Black speculative fiction work internationally. And so I was lucky, I was honored a couple years ago but before all of this, to go to Zimbabwe, to Bulawayo, and work with a collective of Black science fiction writers there. And, they're working on their own stories, putting out anthologies. And so, there's just incredible work happening everywhere. And not just in writing. And so I put up a picture from the film Poomsie, which is not new. It's been out for a while now, but it is, sort of a foundational piece by an African filmmaker. It's a short film. You used to be able to find it on YouTube. I'm not sure if it's still available, but it's, it's an incredible piece. But again, so much, music, art, visuals as well coming from the diaspora. And so I always, whenever people ask me for specific recommendations, I feel like everything I've ever seen or read flies out of my head, which is part of why I always try and put references and resources throughout the presentation. Because the minute someone directly asks me that, I'm like, it's a deer in headlights. So hopefully there's something in what has been shared. And I know Lindsay has been doing an amazing job of sharing that in the chat.
She's been doing a great job. Nnedi Okorafor, I know, and Nikki Drayden wrote something that was, this was my first experience reading Nikki Drayden, was her book Temper. And that was sort of reminded me of like a Wakanda. What if Wakanda went absolutely crazy, wild, insane? So there's a lot out there on the continent.
Yeah, Nnedi Okorafor is amazing. She's a Nigerian American writer, and she's just incredible. There's also a really amazing collection by Nalo Hopkinson called So Long Been Dreaming, which is post-colonial science fiction. It came out a while ago now, but it's really also amazing. And that 100 Years of Speculative Fiction that Cherie Renee Thomas edited, Dark Matter, does have stories, especially Reading the Bones as well. So.
You kind of answered this one a little bit. How does COVID-19 pandemic inspire you? How can we imagine our survival? I'm gonna go to the next one.
Well, I do want to just say about that, I think that in these moments, it's important to recognize that things will change, right? There is no possibility that things have already changed and things will continue changing. And so this is really a chance for us. You know, I think change is hard for humans, and it's hard for me. But in these moments, we get to recognize things are going to change one way or another. So how do we, you know, take this moment and really be part of creating that change that we want to see? And I always think of Octavia E. Butler and her work, where she says the only lasting truth is change. And she says, shape yourself, shape change. How can we shape change? And how do we shape ourselves to be ready to shape change? And so for me, you know, this is a horrific time. It's a brutal time. It's a time of almost staggering, unimaginable loss, and loss that is disproportionately falling on Black and Brown communities, as it does. And it is a moment of Black and Brown and other oppressed people coming together and supporting each other so incredibly and so beautifully in so many different ways, through mutual aid, through being in the street, through social media, through so many different ways. And so how do we root in that? How do we take what we're already doing and how do we grow it? And how do we say, imagine if this was not just something that happened over here. What if this was our entire lives? What if this was our entire society? Now, how do we make that happen?
I'm glad we didn't skip that one. Laura says, I'm a big fan of your work. I'm curious about what you see in your students at PSU. How many of them are already familiar with Octavia Butler's work? Is there a new resurgence of popularity with Butler among younger peoples?
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura, for reading and engaging with my work. Yeah, I mean, Octavia, she is in, you know, it's the Octavia Renaissance, and I'm so thankful to be alive and to be part of it, and we need her now. And, you know, Octavia, her book, Parable of the Sower, just hit this year the New York Times bestseller list for the first time, 25 years after it was published and 14 years after her death, because it is so prescient. You know, people call Octavia a prophet, and she was very clear that she was not prophetic. What she was, you know, she was a student, and she studied. She studied, you know, the world. She studied politics. She studied science. She studied everything. And so the reason so many of her books feel prophetic is because she looked around and said, what is happening now? Let me understand that. And then let me understand how to extrapolate out. If we do not change things, where are we going to be? And unfortunately, by and large, we have not changed things since Octavia's writings in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. So we are on track to be where she is. But I think the other piece, again, about Octavia's work is it is hard and it is rough. It is not, you know, it's not a candy cane and rainbow ride. But it is always hopeful. And it's always hopeful that change is possible, and change that is self-determined and autonomous by Black people. And so these are Black folks who are in the worst of conditions under and being told you can choose this terrible choice or you can choose that terrible choice. And that's it. Those are your two awful options, and you will lose your soul for either one of these. And over again, Octavia has her characters, or main characters, overwhelmingly young Black women say, absolutely not. We will imagine beyond the boundaries of what you're telling us. We will come up with other options. They will not be perfect, but they will be the ones that create enough space for us to build the futures we really dream of. And I think that you know, that framing is what we need now. And that, to me, is the essence of visionary fiction. And so definitely so many more students reading Octavia Butler, so many people reading Octavia E. Butler, because we need her now, along with everything else. You know, it's not an either or, it's a yes and. We need it all. But I think that Octavia, is really built for these, her work is built for these times. And we are so lucky to have her, time traveling from the past to give them to us and say, now please do better. I feel like, speaking of Toni Morrison, I often think Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde and Octavia E. Butler, I can just imagine them hanging out and them just being like, we love y'all so much. We are here for you. Please do better. And we're like, we will for you. So
I like that idea of them hanging out together. Let me see the next question. Speculative works or creators in Black disabled communities you would raise up in the face of normies suddenly enacting all the accommodations they begrudged or claimed impossible before the pandemic. Thank you so much for this. So any works of Black disabled communities you would raise up?
Again, it's really hard for me to give, this is a failing of me and my, I'm like, I put myself out here and then I'm like, I can't do this. I don't, but I think that piece, that framing is so important. And, I again and again, the folks who are at the intersections of identities and oppression, their leadership, their vision, their community building is what liberates all of us. And if we are not supporting that and centering that and taking that leadership, I mean, we've learned that, again, as was said, Black disabled folks have been saying these things for years, and now suddenly it affects us, and now we're able to do things that should have been done for so long. And so it's not specifically Black folks writing, but there are a couple stories in Octavia's Brood that I always think about. One is by Mia Mingus, which is called Hollow, which is set in this alternative world that is rooted in Black and brown, mostly queer and trans, disabled folks who have built their own society on an asteroid. And I think of that society all the time because I want to live there. It is so beautiful, and it meets the needs of everyone, because by centering those folks at the intersections of oppression, it means that everyone else's needs get met as well when those visions, that leadership is centered. Then all of us can be fully present. And it is such a complex, multimodal, adaptive society. And I think about it all the time, and I'm like, I want to go to that asteroid and I want to live in Hollow. I want to go there now. So, there are definitely works, and I will try to think of some and maybe share them with the library so they can email them out to folks when I'm able to think again.
Yeah, someone asked, have you seen the film Cloud Atlas? If so, is there anything about that message that speaks to futurism?
I did not watch Cloud Atlas.
Oh man, that was an interesting film. I was gonna ask you if you had seen Lovecraft and what you thought of that, the Lovecraft Country.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's really like the rooting in Blackness is really incredible. And I think that, I'm very interested in horror, and I think that there has been a strong Black horror resurgence, sort of in the mainstream, led by, the films Get Out, Jordan Peele, and Us, and then all of these other, spaces, Lovecraft's Country, the new Twilight Zone, the Candyman remake, which I'm waiting for with bated breath. And I think, Black horror obviously is part of fantastical work. Horror in general is part of fantastical work. I do think it often occupies a different location than science fiction or fantasy. And I certainly think that Black horror in general, but specifically Black horror, can be visionary fiction. But in some ways, horror is sort of the other side of visionary fiction, in that they serve the same purpose, but in very different ways, right? Because horror is about understanding what we fear and why, and also understanding that we have to remain ever vigilant against those things that terrorize and terrify us, because they're never truly gone. And, that's why, Jason never dies. That's why, these stories can go on. And at the end of the horror film, we're left thinking it could be us. And specifically for Black horror, that roots in that understanding for Black people. It could always be us, whatever that horror is. That institutional violence at any moment could be us. And so in many ways, it's the sort of opposite function of visionary fiction, serving again the same purpose of visionary fiction, sort of imagining the different worlds we want and pushing us to dream bigger, and horror sort of reminding us we have to continue to dream bigger, because these horrors are not going to be defeated. They will re-manifest, and we have to be ready so that we can reassert the visions and the futures that we want, and the freedom that we have earned.
Colleen asks, given that current times are difficult, what are you imagining for your own future that excites you?
It's a great question. I feel like a lot of us are imagining the futures where things that we, had in the past are returned to us. So in some ways, I think about that Sankofa idea a lot, of going back and getting what is lost, like being able to hug people again has been lost, but it is not lost forever, and we will go back and get it. And so, I think about some of those smaller pieces. I think artistically, I am very excited about this film, which is going to be set in a liberated Black future. It's an amazing opportunity for me as a writer to really get to root in the notion of not just how do I describe this world, but what does it look like? And there are so many questions for a film that you don't have to answer as a writer, because in some ways, as a writer, you're working in tandem and in unison. It's a partnership with the reader, because the reader is doing a lot of work. You sort of provide some description, but the reader is filling the rest of it in. So it's really sort of a give and take, where you have to give enough for the reader to be able to kind of manifest this, but every reader will imagine something different. Which I have learned very quickly is not the case for the film, right? But the other piece about that is there is sort of less collaboration on the end of it, but there's so much more collaboration in the process, where one person can make a film, though it often does not go well. Really, some of those films, you're like, you needed a friend to watch this with you, boo. And but just having other writers, the directors, video editors, and designers, and people who are helping you think about these things. And for our process, we're really trying to bring in also community organizers, so that we root these futures and things that feel realistic to folks. So that to me has been very inspiring, as well as just trying to do more work in the community, and to try and, again, just root in the futures that I want. Because in times of crisis, we're told to dream small, right? We're told, you just have to hold on to what you have, because everything's chaotic and you may lose it. So just narrow in and hold what you have. But again, this is the time to dream as big as possible, because everything is changing. Everything will change. Everything has changed. So we need to dream as big as possible, and to grab those futures that we want, because they are there. So I think we have been conditioned to kind of pull in, and it again takes practice, and it takes a communal practice where other people can remind you, like, no, open your arms wide and grab those liberated futures that you want.
And I recognize the Toni Morrison idea that you threw in there about the reader and the writer together creating the novel. I remember she said that, and I was like horrified, because I was so in love with her work. And I was like, oh, I have to create this work when I read it. But in fact, that is the process of reading, is the creation of that story in your head. Shauna asks, can you offer any Afrocentric beliefs, imaginings, principles related to the end of humanity, death, that resonate right now? I mean, beyond just transition.
I'm not entirely sure what that.
That was a hard one for me. I don't know about that one.
Mm-hmm.
And sure. Andrew asks about graphic novels that you might recommend.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of graphic novels. I'm not as big of a graphic novel nerd. I definitely read them, but that's not my area of.
There's one by Nnedi Okorafor.
Yeah.
I had to. Yeah. Have you read that one, The LaGuardia?
I haven't read it, but I know it exists. Yes.
So that one is out, and I think David Walker has one, Bitterroot series out. Oh. I'm not a big graphic novel nerd either, but because I work with kids, I can name a few, and those are great.
And I was just going to share that actually 2 of Octavia Butler's work has been turned into graphic novels. So by John Jennings and Damian Duffy. And John Jennings is an incredible visual artist and thinker who has been sort of leading this Black speculative arts movement, one of the people leading it. And so he did the cover for Octavia's Brood. So Kindred and Parable of the Sower are both graphic novels by Damian Duffy and John Jennings as well, and award-winning and beautiful and incredible adaptations.
I've been wanting to get my hands on those and haven't seen those yet. Shauna says, thank you for suggesting Hollow by Mia Mingus. What you described in that everyone would be better off if thought is something I've recently discussed with friends who share that kind of community and practices trans, queer, neurodivergent, disabled, anti-oppressive. I know there's not a question, but I do, Lindsay, let's see if we can really put Lindsay to the test. There was an anthology of Native American queer short stories that I think was put out by PSU. Let's see if Lindsay can find that book. And it might be, that might be something. Jasmine asks, have you seen Sankofa?
Yes, I have. Sankofa is beautiful. It's a beautiful film, time traveling that talks a lot about the pulling of, and in some ways there's similarities between Kindred and Sankofa, Octavia Butler's book Kindred, where someone is pulled from the present into a Black person is pulled into the enslaved past, and then it's a beautiful, beautiful film. I'd encourage everyone to watch it. I'm actually teaching a Black Futurism, Afrofuturism class at PSU in spring. Just in a few weeks we start, and so we'll definitely be watching Sankofa.
I so wish that I was going to take that course. To have the time. Wondering your thoughts on Black futurist ways of naming and knowing the experience of the Middle Passage. That question comes from Daniel Wenger.
Yeah, I'm like, it's always so challenging in the webinar because you're like, that question, there's so much there. I want to ask more follow-up. Like in real life, you'd be like, talk more about that. So, I think that there's, that's this, the concept of the Middle Passage of slavery, the horrific, brutal, the ultimate horror story for millions and millions upon millions of Black people is, absolutely something that is embedded in, Afrofuturism and Black futurism in many different ways. And, I think even when folks are imagining different futures, that is something that is, is very much present. And I'm trying to remember the name. There's a movement, and it's basically focused on this sort of creative imagining of what if the Black folks who had gone overboard during the Middle Passage actually survived and became sort of aquatic like humans who live under the water. Starts with a D, their names. Maybe someone knows and could drop it in the chat. It's like, Yes, there we go. See, collective brilliance, y'all. This is why we are smarter and better together. Thank you, Cece. Boom, there it is. Drexia. So, I think that, there are folks, it is absolutely something that is present constantly. And then there are folks who are specifically drawing on and engaging in that as well. Yeah, Rivers of Solomon too. Thank you, Lori.
Lindsay did not find the book that I was talking about, but she found another book that I totally want to read now. Thank you for not finding the correct book and finding a different book that I wasn't aware of. I was going to say about the Middle Passage, there's a children's book. Tristan Strong punches a hole in the universe or in the sky, and that book imagines an experience with the Middle Passage. Are there ways you are cultivating nonlinear time in your life right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word cultivating it's a very good word, right? Because we're all dealing with nonlinear time now, but we're not necessarily cultivating it. We're being held hostage by it.
Right.
We're living this ridiculous, brutal Groundhog's Day existence where every day feels like the same day, and where time is like completely elongated and then also completely sped up at the same time. I mean, I think that we have all, if we have not all learned the fallacy of linear time at this point, and the idea that there is no such thing as linear time, we are never going to learn that. But, I think that idea of cultivating it is a really powerful one. And, my framework is really recognizing that when we challenge linear time is, individually, but especially in terms of our organizing and collectively, what it means is that we can reach into the past and reach into the future, especially. And so, we often talk about the future as a destination, or even, a way of being that we are moving towards. But I like to think about the future as something that we can pull into the present constantly. We can defy linear time and pull those futures that we want into the present. And we can do that through, how we engage and treat each other. We can do that in how we structure our organizing work. We can do that on how we plan our conferences and our gatherings. We can do that on how we engage with the people who live with us and around us. And so, I've been at conferences like the Allied Media Project conference, which I think is Allied Media Conference, which is one of the most incredible experiences. And being there feels like living the futures I dream of. And it is, it's beautiful and it's thoughtful and it's complex and it's contradictory, and there's always more work to do. But it feels like I've time traveled 50 or 100 years in the future, but we pull that into the present. And so, it may only last for 7 days, but we have defied linear time and we have literally embodied the liberated futures we want. And I think when you think of it that way, it feels very empowering to me, because then it means we have the power to do that anytime we want. We can continually be pulling those liberated futures into the present. And maybe we can't hold on to them completely, but we can pull them in again and again and again until at some point, that distinction blurs and it's all our lived reality. And so I think that to me is how I've been thinking about cultivating that notion of nonlinear time paired with, liberated futures, and really seeing our own power in that, again, individually, but especially collectively. And it doesn't have to be an entire conference. It can be a conversation. It can be an evening that you spend on Zoom with someone. It can be a way that you're engaging with a neighbor. But we constantly have the power to live those liberated futures we want.
I love that you said that. And we have come to 7:29. We can live those liberated futures that we want is a perfect way to end this. Thank you so much for your presentation and your thoughtful responses to all those questions. I would have been hard put to answer those, but you handled them beautifully. And I hope that I will see you in the near future, not on our 1-year anniversary, our 2-year anniversary.
Our 2-year anniversary. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Ebony, for creating this space and for the work that you and BCLA do to just create spaces for Blackness in the library and in Portland. And thank you to everyone for coming and for the amazing conversations and questions. And I love the dialogue and engagement between y'all. And thank you for having my back with the suggestions. Like, again, we are so much better collectively and so much more, you know, brilliant and ingenious, and we can support each other, and, you know, we can all shine bright like diamonds. Let me end on a Rihanna quote. It was not my plan, but here we are.
For throwing every single thing that we mentioned into the chat and things that I didn't even mention that were new to me. That was beautiful and brilliant. And we'll have to do this again.
Thank y'all so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks, Lindsay.